Hi everybody, we've understood what the big gains of trade are, but now we're going to move into why nations might want to protect their economies, to protect industries from imports, and distort the market in the process. Now, you should know there are lots of different types of protectionism: tariffs, tax on imports, quota, which is a quantity limit on imports, embargoes, a ban on imports, subsidies to domestic producers to lower their costs of production, lower their prices, to make it easy for them to compete internationally, but also admin barriers like red tape, like health and safety standards, like strict environmental standards. These are all different types of protectionism. So you need to make sure you're aware of protectionism in terms of any barrier that restricts free trade taking place between nations. So these are the arguments why countries might want to do it. The first one is the infant industry argument. So if there are newly kind of developing firms in a nation that haven't had the time to grow and kind of become big like its international rivals, a government may decide to put a tax on imports, put a tariff, put a quota on imports coming in of goods and services related to these industries, just to allow domestic firms to grow in size, to develop the same kind of economies of scale, which will give them leverage to compete with big multinational, international corporations around the world. While they are young and small, they won't have the economies of scale benefits that these established firms will. So in the short term, give them time to develop these economies of scale, to grow in size, to produce greater levels of quantity, and then take away the protectionist measures when they can compete. That's the idea behind the infant industry argument. When they don't have the economies of scale, give them breathing space to develop them. But you can argue it's a bit of a weak argument, because if you do protect infant industries, you're allowing them kind of room for inefficiency. And this may distort the theory a little bit. Okay, so as we go through, I'm going to do that a bit, just give some evaluation points for each idea. The second one is an interesting idea, to protect against dumping. What's dumping? Well, dumping is when a country decides to sell certain goods or services below their costs of production. So maybe in a given nation, if there are excess subsidies on given goods and services, there might end up being an excess supply of them. So a nation may decide to dump those goods and services, sell them below costs of production in other countries. And the countries where these products are being sold are going to be hit very hard. Domestic industries are going to be hit very hard. How can they compete with prices below cost? So a government may retaliate against that and decide to actually impose protectionist measures, a tax on these goods, or an embargo on these goods or something, if they feel that they're being dumped in their economy. So that's an argument against that. But the evaluation is that dumping is very hard to prove. Very hard to prove. And often dumping comes from subsidies in a given nation, which creates this excess supply, or minimum prices, which creates an excess supply. But it's hard to prove that dumping is actually taking place. And if you do protect thinking that dumping is taking place, if it's proved that it's not actually taking place, there could be strict retaliation against you. So maybe evaluation here, trade talks are the most appropriate way of trying to solve a dispute which is dumping related. Third one, to protect against domestic employment. So if a government feels like domestic employment is going to suffer and there could be massive structural unemployment problems, if industries go into decline because of how difficult it is to compete with firms abroad, they may decide to adopt protectionist measures to protect employment, maybe to boost employment as well. The argument against that one, though, is that if the industry was already going into decline, if it was already losing out on its comparative advantage relative to other countries, you're just longing out a process that's already going to happen. So the argument might be just allow kind of natural disintegration of that industry and allow workers to move into other industries if possible, and accept the kind of the short-term costs of unemployment if they are going to occur. Fourth argument is to protect against unfair low-cost labour abroad. So if a nation feels like it just can't compete because of unfair advantages abroad, like low-cost labour, it might decide to protect against imports coming in from those nations. So countries like Asia, China, India will have a lot of low-cost labour, and if countries feel that they can't compete with those, they may decide to use protectionist measures against them, to give them the kind of level playing field to work with. To protect product standards is a good argument, really. So things like strict environmental standards, strict product safety standards, that kind of thing, as protectionist measures to protect against poor quality of goods coming into your country. Maybe contaminated products or products that might be quite dangerous to consume. To protect against a certain kind of standard of product coming into your country, that's a good reason why. To raise government revenue, absolutely. For developing countries, this is quite a big argument, especially obviously from tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. So if you impose a tariff, you can collect revenue, government revenue, which can be used to, in developing countries, fund important things like public goods, infrastructure, America's like education and healthcare. So in that sense, raising government revenue might be a big argument, especially in developing countries. And import tariffs are quite easy to collect as well, so another reason why developing countries may want to adopt them. Maybe it's to improve the current account deficit. Bit of a weak argument, this one, because of the retaliation you can expect against you as a nation, but in theory anyway, if you're importing huge amounts, you're spending huge amounts as a nation on imports, imposing protectionist measures will restrict the amount of spending on imports and help improve the current account deficit, and maybe even increase economic growth. Reducing the amount of import expenditure may lead to an increase in the X minus M equation, X minus M bracket in the AD equation. But in reality, if that's the reason you're protecting or using protectionist measures, expect very severe retaliation. So not the best argument for protectionism there. Number 8 is to avoid the risk of over-specialization. So by protecting yourself from imports coming in from abroad, you may allow yourself to delve into other industries, to allow yourself to develop other industries, to make sure that if your major industry where you have an advantage goes into decline or struggles to compete with foreign competition, you have other industries out there which can produce products for you to sell, to avoid the risk of over-specialization and relying purely on one industry for growth and for export potential. So these are the main arguments for protectionism here. Make sure you learn these really, really well, and make sure you can apply these arguments when it comes to writing essays on protectionism. So I hope you kind of understood that. I hope you've taken that all away. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time with another video. Thank you.